One of my favorite verses in the Bible is Genesis 50:20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. I love that verse, but it's really important to quote it within the right context. This verse is in the story of Joseph, who went through 13 years of extreme hardship to get to this revelation. Genesis 50:20 comes after many seasons where Joseph was able to gain this unique perspective after going through a process of learning to forgive. You intended to harm me, he's saying to his brothers who hurt him, rejected him, abandoned him, sold him. But God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. The statement to hold on to this week is, with God, there's always a meanwhile. We must remember that for all the hurts and hardships we go through, this statement, with God, there's always a meanwhile, is something that we can speak back to ourselves and really gain a lot of perspective. You see, there's always the physical reality of what we see right in front of us. The hurts, the hardships, the heartbreaks, all of it. It's all real, and we're not living in denial of any of it. But the physical reality is not the full story, because at the same time, there is a spiritual reality of what our good God is always doing. Indeed, with God, there's always a meanwhile. Now let's go back and find where the story begins and explore some of those hardships and those years of suffering that Joseph went through before Genesis 50:20. Genesis 37, verse 2 says this. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Now I have to say, right as I get into this, I want you to notice something that I find kind of telling. Normally, it would start out with the oldest son, but that's not what's happening here. It starts out talking about Joseph, one of the younger sons. It says, Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Hardword and the sons of Hardword, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now, let's just stop there. Right away, how do you think that this family dynamic is going to unfold? Because honestly, when I look at this, I see a brother tattletelling on his other brothers, which is such a display of a certain amount of family dysfunction. And honestly, I love that the Bible's honest enough that one of the major biblical families, this is Jacob, the father who is going to have 12 sons that turn into the 12 tribes of Israel, providing such the major backbone of most of the Old Testament. It's mind-blowing to me that this biblical family is putting their dysfunction on display. But honestly, it helps me have hope, because I want my family to be biblical, but we sure do have a lot of dysfunction. I would imagine if I was seated with you right now, we could pass the microphone around and you could all share just some family dysfunction in your reality with your family. And if we got to you and you had nothing to say, you might be the family dysfunction. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying it could be. The point being, though, all families have complicated realities, and this biblical family is no exception. So we continue on in verse 3. Now, Israel, that's another name for Jacob, the father, loved Joseph, the young man of 17, more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. And so again, what we're seeing here is some very complicated realities for this family and some deep hurt that has sat inside the brothers' hearts for so long, it's turned to hate. And I do want to tell you a little bit about this robe. This robe was not just a lavish gift that was given to Joseph and not to the other brothers. This was a statement. You see, to put on this ornate robe, this was sending a message to the other brothers that Joseph, wearing this ornate robe, he wasn't going to have to work like them. And we see this playing out in the story because he's often the one at home with the father while the brothers are out in the field working. So you can imagine just seeing him wear this robe is stirring up animosity in the brothers' hearts because it's not fair and it hurts. And unattended to hurt within the human heart can often turn to hate. Then Joseph has a dream. And this is one of those things that when I read starting in Genesis 37:5, I kind of want to say, Joseph, please be aware enough to know that maybe you shouldn't share this dream with your brothers who are already really not so impressed with you. But he's 17, and I guess sometimes when you're 17, you don't know what you don't know, right? So here we go. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, verse 5, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. His brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? In other words, do you think you're really going to be the boss of us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. And so then Joseph has another dream, and that's when you really, it's kind of like watching a scary movie, like, don't go to the shed. Don't go to the basement. Why do you always go to the shed and the basement? You know you shouldn't go there. I want to say to Joseph, don't share your dream with your brothers who already hate you. But he does. And things do not go well once again. And the scriptures say that his brothers were jealous of him, verse 11, but his father kept the matter in mind. Verse 12, now his brothers had gone out to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and the father, Israel, also known as Jacob, said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them. Now, why isn't Joseph out working in the fields with his brothers? Because he's sitting at home wearing his fancy robe. So when the brothers see Joseph coming, how do you think it's going to go? Not so great. Joseph says to his father, very well. And the father instructs him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. The father is setting him up to tattletale on his brothers again. And so Joseph is sent off. And it says, then when Joseph arrived at Shechem, verse 15, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Now go all the way to verse 18. When the brothers see him, verse 18, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. So then, as Joseph comes, the brothers decide, let's not kill him. Actually, we could make money off of him if we sell him. So they do throw him in a pit, and they do strip him of his robe, and then merchants come by and they sell their brother as a slave to the foreign merchants. And then the brothers take the robe and dip it in animal's blood and make it look like indeed Joseph was attacked by an animal. And they go home and they tell the father, and the father assumes, in fact, that Joseph is dead. And then the scriptures say, meanwhile, look at verse 36 of Genesis 37. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of the Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Now, if you do write in your Bible, or if you're taking notes, you just want to circle this word meanwhile, because remember the statement to hold on to, with God, there's always a meanwhile. You see, I would imagine what Joseph is going through right now is almost that feeling of the rug being ripped out from underneath him. He thought life was going to look this way. Remember his dream? He thought he was going to be a ruler, and he imagined that he would be the leader of his brothers. But now the physical reality of what Joseph sees is nothing like what he imagined. I understand that feeling, and I bet to some extent you do too. But though the physical reality of what Joseph is seeing is the rejection of his brothers, meanwhile, God is actually going to use it as a protection of Joseph's calling. Because you see, Joseph probably wasn't able to be in a position where he could have led his brothers. His brothers hated him. His brothers were not going to listen to him. And so God didn't cause this. The brothers caused this. But God is going to use this actually as a protection of Joseph's calling. Because when Joseph gets into Potiphar's house, he actually has God's favor on him, and he becomes a leader. Look at what it says in Genesis chapter 39. Now Joseph, verse 1, had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. And the Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And so, are things ideal for Joseph? No. But Joseph is being obedient in the situation that he's in. He's honoring God, and God is placing his favor on him. And so Joseph becomes in charge of all of Potiphar's house. And at this point, don't you want to just go, okay, things are not ideal, but at least Joseph is in an okay place. So let's just tie a bow around this and leave Joseph there. But we all know life is never that tidy, right? And there is this complicated reality about Joseph. I don't know another way to say it, so I'm just going to say it like this. He's hot. Now, before you start doubting me, I want you to look at verse 6 of Genesis 39. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome, #hot, and after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Now, you guys, can I just be honest with you? If I ever were to speak words that would be recorded in the Bible, I'm not going to want it to be those 5 words, okay? It's like if I get to heaven one day, and maybe Potiphar's wife will be there, maybe, I don't know. But if I meet her, and I go to shake her hand, I say, "Hi, I'm Lisa, who are you?" And she says, "Potiphar's wife," I think I might go, "Whoa, girl, whoa, I memorized your verse." That was a statement. So this is a very difficult reality that Joseph is in. His master's wife is really throwing herself at Joseph. But Joseph, who is honoring the Lord, even though he's not in an ideal situation, he refuses her, and he decides to honor his master. And he tells her no, and she continues her pursuit of Joseph, and he continues to tell her no. And then one day, she literally throws herself at him, and Joseph, to get away from her, runs. She grabs his cloak and holds it up and falsely accuses Joseph of being the one to pursue her. And Potiphar believes his wife, and now Joseph is thrown into prison. But with God, remember, there's always a meanwhile. So in the physical reality of what Joseph is seeing, it's this problematic commotion, an unfair accusation of Potiphar's wife. But with God, God is going to take that really difficult situation, the unfair commotion, and he's actually going to use it to give Joseph a promotion to prison. We don't often think about prison being a promotion, but when Joseph goes to prison, he gains such favor with the warden, he is put in charge of the entire prison. He develops systems of how to run the prison. He develops strategies of effective leadership. And if you can lead a big group of prisoners, you can probably lead anyone. And so I'm kind of shocked at the both and of this situation. Yes, Joseph is in prison, and that's hard. And he's there because he was falsely accused, and that's wrong. But God is going to take even that and use it to help prepare Joseph for what God sees as this amazing assignment on Joseph's life. So while in prison, Joseph meets two interesting people. They used to be the Pharaoh's baker and his cupbearer. Now, things don't go so well for the baker, so I will let you just read that part on your own. But things go a little better for the cupbearer. They both have dreams. Joseph, who can interpret dreams, reveals to them that the baker has a hard story, but the cupbearer is going to be released from prison. And Joseph says to the cupbearer, when you get out of this prison, remember me. Genesis 40:14. But when all goes well with you, remember me, Joseph says, and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. So here we see such a perfect display of how hard this is on Joseph. You see, Joseph only sees what's right in front of him, and that's so very much the way we see. But as we read Joseph's story, we can see, wow, yes, this is hard, and this is really complicated, but with God, there is a meanwhile. God is going to do something. Now, I wish I could tell you that the cupbearer got out of prison and remembered to tell Pharaoh, and Joseph was released, and we all sing Kumbaya, but that's not the story. It says in the scriptures in Genesis 41, verse 1, when 2 full years had passed. When 2 full years had passed, in other words, Joseph stayed in prison for 2 full years, longer. And yes, he was leading, and yes, he was doing great things, but every night he was still laying his head on a bed in a dungeon. And as I read this, I know how long 2 full years is. And part of what makes it so hard when we're in really difficult situations is we live that out very daily, and every day is hard. And sometimes it's really easy to lose footing in our own story because when it lasts a long time, we start to feel like it's more and more unfair, and we can start to wonder, where are you, God? Are you even doing anything to help me? That's why it's so important to look at stories like Joseph's so we can see the beginning all the way to the end, and we can trace God's hand of faithfulness throughout the hard experiences that Joseph had, because we can let it help us find courage in our own story, even before we know how everything's going to turn out. Even if we don't know how the circumstances of our lives are going to wind up, we do know the goodness of God will be there, even in the midst of the hardest moments and the longest days and the seasons that stretch on and on and on. And maybe when we look at Joseph's story, it can feed our faith and courage for our own stories. Part of what makes forgiveness so hard is the question, can I really even forgive in the middle of my story when I don't know how everything's going to turn out? I face that question. I know how hard that is. But I will say, forgiveness is the perfect start to our healing. It shouldn't be our last resort. When I go and look at Joseph's story, it says when 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. And guess who knows how to interpret dreams? Joseph does. And finally, the cupbearer is like, wow, I finally remember there's this Hebrew man in prison who can interpret dreams. And then look at what it says in Genesis 41:14. that Pharaoh finally sends for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon, because when it is the right time, God's time becomes quick time. Joseph was brought out of prison, and he stands before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh reveals to him this dream. Joseph interprets there's going to be 7 years of plenty, and you need to save up. And then there's going to be 7 years of famine, and during those 7 years of famine, you will be okay as long as you save up during the 7 years of plenty. And not only does Joseph interpret the dream, but the way that he is so strategically brilliant as he speaks with Pharaoh, look at Pharaoh's response in Genesis 41:39. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." From prison to the second most powerful man in all the land. Now, here's where I want to land today. Imagine if the cupbearer would have gotten out and told Pharaoh about Joseph, and Pharaoh would have said, "Okay, let him out of prison." Joseph would have never had an audience with Pharaoh. Joseph would have never been able to put all that God taught him on display. Joseph would have never risen to the position of leadership now that God had given him a vision for all the way back at age 17. Truly, it's amazing when I read Joseph's story and I can so clearly see that we do not serve a do-nothing God. God's hand of faithfulness and goodness was there even when, maybe even especially when, Joseph couldn't understand it. The story goes on, and it's really fascinating. I encourage you to read it on your own. But eventually, that famine that hit Egypt after the 7 years of plenty, it does extend all the way to where the brothers are at. We'll talk about that more next week. But Joseph eventually has to make the decision to forgive his brothers or not. That, my friends, is where we get Genesis 50:20. "You intended to harm me," Joseph is saying to his brothers who are afraid. Joseph could have surely punished them for what they'd done to him. He could have withheld food from them, but he doesn't. He'd been in a long season of hardship, yes, but he'd also been in a long season of trusting God. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." I don't think Joseph's life ever looked like what he thought it would look like. But did God use it all for good? Absolutely. Not just for Joseph's good, but for many other people. Wow. May it be so with us as well. With God, there's always a meanwhile.